The Brothers Kennedy, John Robert Edward, by Kathleen Kroll, illustrated by Amy June Bates. We stand at the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unfulfilled hopes and dreams. John. We are a great country, a selfless country, and a compassionate country. Robert. We are all part of the American family, and we have a responsibility to help members of that family when they are in need. Edward. Joe. Joe Kennedy lived to tease his tough big brother Joe. When Joe wasn't looking, John would steal the frosting off Joe's slice of cake. Instantly, a fist fight would start, and John would lose. But John never stopped teasing Joe, thinking that one day he'd win. It just wasn't in him to give up hope. Hope, compassion, and loyalty. These were what mattered to the Kennedys, a prominent Irish-American family in Boston. But to the 9 Kennedy children, Joe, John, Rosemary, Kathleen, and Enos, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and Edward, it was also important to win. Joe once told a friend, "You know, I'm the oldest of my family, and I've got to be the example." He was 17 years older than the youngest, Edward. The older Kennedys inspired the younger ones to do better, at sports, at school, and at the dinner table, where they talked about what they had read in the newspaper that day. Joe had heard about the "No Irish Needed" apply signs in certain parts of Boston, but he was so used to winning that even as a boy he talked about rising to the top and becoming President of the United States. The idea of an Irish Catholic in the White House was unthinkable, except to those who knew Joe. John. More than anything, John hoped to prove himself the equal of his idol Joe, but John was almost constantly sick. Robert would joke, "If a mosquito bit my brother, the mosquito would die." During John's hospital stays, visitors could hardly see the boy for the stacks of books around him. John was the biggest reader in the family. On walks around Boston with Robert, John would talk about strong leaders like George Washington, Lawrence of Arabia, and King Arthur and his knights. By reading about these heroes, John came to believe that one person really could change history through deeds of hope, compassion, and loyalty. Even when they were younger, it was clear that the Kennedy brothers were headed for politics. John made his first public speech when he was just 6 years old, in honor of his grandfather, the governor of Massachusetts. John never became as good at sports as Joe was. In the evenings, John would practice passing the football hundreds of times until it was too dark to see. Over the years, he lost hope of becoming a football star, but gained the hope of becoming a leader. He liked to gather his younger siblings around the fireplace and tell them about leaders in history, those who used their power to make people's lives better. In high school, John ran for freshman class president and lost, but in his senior year, he was voted most likely to succeed. Robert. Robert was the quiet one, struggling to keep up with his idols, Joe and John. At age 4, Robert decided to teach himself to swim as well as they could. Over and over, he'd jump into the icy cold of Cape Cod. Over and over, his brothers would dive in and rescue him until he could swim on his own. Robert was the first to call, "That's not fair," when he thought others were breaking football rules. He never joined in bullying, so compassionate that he'd even try to stop it when he could. Riding the train to high school, he saw poor neighborhoods from the window and started questioning how America could allow such inequality. It was so serious that John called him Black Robert. Edward. When the youngest Kennedy was born, 15-year-old John asked to be the baby's godfather and suggested the name George Washington. His parents chose Edward instead. Edward's older brothers taught him how to swim and sail, ride a bike, throw a football, and pillow fight. Together they protected their sister Rosemary, who developed special needs. Edward loved to make his brothers laugh and loyally followed them everywhere, even when they jumped off cliffs. "I was pretty scared, but they all seemed to be doing it," he said later. With each brother putting pressure on the next, Edward got the most. As with his brothers before him, it was important to Edward to win. In both 6th and 7th grade, he was elected to class office. "In a crisis," John once said, "family members are the only ones you can count on." The Kennedy children were enormously proud of one another and always defended each other, and no one was prouder of them than their father. He couldn't wait for his children, especially his 4 sons, to start serving their country. The first big step for both Joe and John was going off to fight in World War II. Joe, the most promising of the Kennedy sons, never had a chance to run for office. He died at age 29 as a fighter pilot in the war, and the Kennedys never really recovered from the shock of losing him. That left 3 brothers, John, Robert, and Edward. Their parents had raised them with the values of hope, compassion, and loyalty, the same values that guided them as they went on to lives of public service. After the war ended, John started to run for office. The entire family focused on helping him win his first election in 1946. During his 14 years in Congress, John continued to read about heroes in history and urged his brothers to learn about them too. Finally, in one of the closest elections ever, John was elected the first Catholic president, our youngest president, a president with a whole new hope for the future. He set out to be the kind of heroic leader he had read about, someone who had people's lives better. Yes, America was a great country, but so much more could be done. "Ask not what your country can do for you," he said. "Ask what you can do for your country." John was the first president to speak about equal rights for African Americans, saying that this change would not happen without new laws to end the discrimination. He announced a goal of putting a man on the moon within the following decade. He started the Peace Corps as a way of bringing hope to the poorest countries in the world, and the thousands of Americans volunteered to serve. He encouraged people, especially young people, to enter public service and be part of something great and hopeful. Many people started to use him as their role model, a leader and inspiration in his own right. 1,000 days into his presidency, John was shot and killed. Hundreds of thousands of people came to his funeral, standing in a line 3 miles long, with millions more crying as they watched it on TV. That a life full of such hope and promise could be cut short at age 46 was a shock that anyone alive then will never forget. And then there were 2 brothers. Robert had grown up to become John's best friend and main advisor. Though Robert could act tough, he also knew how to put himself in other people's shoes, even from a young age. He had felt compassion for those living in poverty in America. Now, just the thought of it made him sick to his stomach. After John's death, Robert's compassion became a fight to get rid of injustice. As a senator and later a presidential candidate, Robert traveled unpaved back roads to the Mississippi Delta to meet with starving children. He marched with Mexican migrant workers to fight for the rights of those who pick our fruits and vegetables. He visited American Indians on reservations, appalled at the living conditions. Poor people and minorities, groups that felt ignored by politicians, were especially excited about Robert. But while running for president, Robert was shot and killed. And then there was one brother. Edward had grown from being the family clown to being his brother's most loyal supporter. During their campaigns, he could always be counted on, seeming to be everywhere at once. Whenever John was sick and his voice failed, Edward spoke in his place. While stuck in traffic jam, Edward would jump out and offer campaign bumper stickers to the other drivers. When Edward became a senator at age 30, his very first speech was on civil rights for African Americans. It was his way of being loyal to John's memory. After Robert's death, Edward carried on his brother's commitment to compassion, pouring his energy into making laws that protected the most needy people. Lugging a briefcase full of papers home with him every night, he was usually the most prepared person in a meeting. As a senator for more than 46 years, Edward worked on laws that helped just about every man, woman, and child in America. He served in the Senate for longer than almost anyone else in its history. In 2008, Edward's doctors warned him that he was too ill to travel, but back in the 1960s, his brother Robert had predicted that a black president would be elected within 40 years. Edward was not going to miss seeing Barack Obama accept his presidential nomination. For me, this is a season of hope, Edward said in his own speech that night. New hope for justice and fair prosperity for the many, and not just for the few. Less than a year later, he died. Hope, compassion, and loyalty. The brothers Kennedy inspired these in one another, and so they have inspired others ever since. Let the world go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans. John. Each time a man stands up for an idea, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. Robert. I believe that each of us, as individuals, must not only struggle to make a better world, but to make ourselves better too. Edward. And